Yes.
Yes.
Let's move on to Red Rock West then.
So, by chance, I think, rather than Craig's intention, we have 2 John Dahl directed films in this episode. The first of which is 1993's Red Rock West, starring Nicolas Cage and Lara Flynn Boyle. J.T. Walsh also, and Dennis Hopper. Cage is Michael Williams, a drifter from Texas looking to get a job on an oil drilling crew in Wyoming. When that doesn't work, he takes his last $5, gets some
He's deaf
petrol,
in one ear.
and heads out on the road. Eventually stopping in Red Rock, where he walks into a bar and encounters J.T. Walsh's Wayne. Clocking Michael's Texas license plate, Wayne assumes Michael to be Lyle from Dallas, the overdue hitman he expected last week. Okay, I think you get the joke, so I'll stop.
You're giving Scott a goddamn editing nightmare here.
Unaware at first of the nature of employment, but desperately in need of same, Michael plays along with the case of mistaken identity, playing it cool when receiving $5,000 and instructions to bump off Wayne's wife Suzanne, Lara Flynn Boyle. He lets himself into Suzanne's house with the key he was given, informs her of the contract, and receives double the payment from her to kill Wayne instead. But being a very moral man, Michael decides simply to take the money from the would-be murderers by proxy, write a letter to the Red Rock sheriff, and leave town with no one hurt, which seems pretty ethically sound to me. Unfortunately, Michael hits a man in the middle of the road outside of town and is compelled to take him to hospital, back in Red Rock. 2 further complications arise at the hospital. Before being hit by Michael's car, the guy in the road had already been hit by 2 bullets, and the sheriff arrives. A sheriff whose name so happens to be Wayne. Oh dear. Soon Michael and Wayne are taking a nice little car trip together, so skedaddle time for Michael at the first opportunity. The real Lyle from Dallas, Hopper, turns up dressed like Cage acts, i.e. ridiculously and exaggeratedly, and encounters Michael by nearly running him down the road as he flees from Wayne. They at first bond over being Marines, but Lyle's insistence on buying Michael a drink is complicated by this drink being offered at Wayne's pub, and Wayne's due back any moment. Skedaddle, take 2. But first he should warn Suzanne, and she's not quite ready to leave town yet, so it's back to Red Rock they go. The running gag entering Red Rock and leaving Red Rock signs ought to have had their own credits. The centre of the film is Cage, in a fairly toned down role. Look, everything's relative, okay? Michael's not stupid, but also not the wily and cunning fox his situation often demands, with his honesty causing him more trouble than he may consider it worth after a while. He's always playing catch-up to events, but is adept enough at bluffing until he gathers more information and formulates a plan. And watching Cage experiencing these situations is fun. J.T. Walsh is also an interesting villain, trying reason more often than intimidation, and more of him and less of Dennis Hopper would have been welcome. Talking of Hopper, on a scale of Dennis Hopper performances, this probably lands somewhere between Speed and Super Mario Brothers. Make of that what you will. Sadly, Lara Flynn Boyle is out of her depth, though that'd be more of an issue if Red Rock's tone was darker, more serious than it is. Red Rock West is a reasonably entertaining film, but really serves more as an appetizer for other John Dahl film, which outshines it in every way, particularly in its humour and its femme fatale. However, Dahl's clearly a fan of the noir and western genres, and he has a bit of fun with both here in this mix-up, and it's definitely worth a watch.
How rare is it to say that I watched a Nick Cage film where the most believable character in it was Nick Cage? It's just not something that typically happens. In an episode where, gotta be honest, slender pickings for me this episode. This one didn't mind so much. Quite liked the kind of more jokey tones of it, and I particularly liked having an almost reasonable, normal character in Nick Cage's character just blundering his way through it with being kind of relatable in a way when you've got guys like Dennis Hopper doing what would usually be the Nick Cage role. And it works reasonably well. I wasn't blown away by anything, but it's quite enjoyable enough film. And I particularly should mention that this is a soundtrack that, because it's kind of a western almost as much as it is a noir, has a soundtrack that I actually quite liked, because it's not saxophones constantly. So that's cool.
Nobody in this film was only 2 days away from retirement when any of this happened. So, straight up front, this film is the biggest single reason why I proposed this episode. And it is a film I've had a huge amount of affection for, and I've watched any number of times, and I suppose probably most recently about 10 years ago. And I loved this film intensely, and so I was quite disappointed to come back to it now. I wish I'd let it live on in my memory, because for all the times I'd watched it and enjoyed it before, I really could only see the flaws in it this time. And I don't know if that's because it's the first time that I've come to it looking critically, but something was really lacking this time round. Well, something that clearly wasn't there to begin with, but I don't remember this film playing quite so humorously as it does. I remember it being a lot more serious. I remember it being a lot more oppressive in its atmosphere. The score that you mentioned, Scott, I have, and this just goes to show how, well, whether or not it's just memory being unreliable or it's just that tastes have changed or really it just hasn't aged well. I know you're saying like you like the soundtrack. I remember the soundtrack to this film being my favourite aspect of it, and even that underwhelmed me this time. That really minimalist, almost like Ry Cooder on ketamine kind of guitar. You know exactly what I mean. Just that like 3 guitar chords played really. Yeah, exactly. I remember that being my favourite thing about it, and I remember Lara Flynn Boyle, who is rarely, at this period in particular, anything less than an absolute smoke show. I remember her being easily the most smouldering femme fatale amongst the films with which I'm familiar, which are on this list that we'll talk about tonight. And none of this proved to be true this time round. And I think the ludicrous nature of certain aspects of the film, there are certain parts that I just, on a normal day, I would be able to forgive, and have clearly done so in the past. And for whatever reason, I don't know if just turning 40 just flips a switch in a white British man's head or something. But the scene, like for example, where he's escaping on top of the truck, walking across the plank between the roof of the bar and the trailer of the truck, and the truck driver and his mate are standing conservatively 3 feet below Nick Cage and don't notice a man walking across a plank onto the roof of the truck. And also, I've got great problems with any film whose climax in particular, but really any part of the film, hinges on anyone throwing a knife accurately. I just don't believe that as a thing that happens in the real world. I'm sorry, outside of circus sideshows, and I don't think Dennis Hopper, for all his theatricality, ever worked in a circus sideshow. Yeah, I just really found myself finding faults with it this time, and I'm not going to say it's necessarily killed this film outright, because there are still aspects I enjoyed. I really like Nicolas Cage in this film, because it's one of his most low-key performances in a while, like really low-key to the point where he's kind of standing still in Cage terms, relative Cage terms. He is at an absolute standstill for a lot of this, and I think he can be all the more effective for that. But it's just something really missing this time round, and it was the first film that I sat down to rewatch in preparation for this podcast, and it just set a really unfortunate tone for the rest of my viewing. So, but yes, like you say, Scott, I think yourself, Drew, maybe perhaps there is certainly a much superior John Dahl femme fatale to look forward to, at least in our near future. And yeah, I can't say much more than that.